The birds were my alarm clock. Every morning since I retired, I let their warbled songs filter through the open kitchen window while I sipped my first cup of coffee, Moss Ones. No sirens, no dispatch calls crackling through my radio, just the rustle of the oak trees out back and the steady hum of quiet life in Emphasis Cedar Crest, a place that promised peace at least on paper. I'd bought the house 2 years after turning in my badge and stepping down as commander of the regional police precinct. 32 years in uniform was enough. I'd seen more than my share of chaos, grief, and the worst of human behavior. So I'd chosen this small gated neighborhood outside of Austin for its calm, its distance from city noise, and the way my wife Rachel looked at the backyard and said, "I can plant real tomatoes here." And we did. Raised beds, bird baths, a small workshop I built with my own hands tucked behind a lattice of honeysuckle. I kept my tools sharp and my days simple. But peace, I've learned, is fragile. It started with a letter, a folded slip of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of my old Dodge Ram, like some parking ticket from another world. At first, I thought it was a flyer. I only looked closer after I poured my second cup of coffee. Mr. Hale, your front porch lighting violates HOA guidelines on wattage. Please replace bulbs with HOA-approved models. Max 60 lumens. Failure to comply may result in fines. Karen Elms, HOA president. I blinked. 60 lumens, that's barely brighter than a nightlight. At the bottom was a printed signature, and a line I'd come to know all too well. Emphasis, maintaining standards for the harmony of Cedar Crest. I thought it was a mistake, an overzealous neighbor maybe, or someone new who didn't realize I'd been here longer than the new paint on their shutters. But the letters kept coming. One week it was the unauthorized planter boxes near the curb. The next, my flagpole was non-compliant for being too tall, even though it had been approved by the city years ago, back when I hosted neighborhood BBQs on Memorial Day. Then came the driveway. My wife Rachel Hale had asked our nephew to help reseal it. Nothing fancy, just a layer of blacktop. But the next morning, another letter arrived. Any structural modifications must be pre-approved by the HOA Architectural Committee. This includes resealing. The kicker, there was no architectural committee. Just Karen Elms. I'd met her once at a community function, early 50s prim with a tight bun of iron gray hair and a clipboard seemingly glued to her hand. The kind of woman who measured life in rulebooks. She had the air of someone who longed to command something, or someone. At the block party, she'd asked me what I used to do before retiring to garden. I'd simply said, public service. She nodded unimpressed and moved on to critique someone's lawn edging. Over the next few months, her letters escalated. When I trimmed the hedge, she sent a warning about noise violations after 7 p.m. When I replaced the wooden slats on my fence, I got hit with a notice about aesthetic uniformity. At first, I tried reasoning with her. I left voicemails. I sent polite emails asking for clarification. No response. Instead, I started getting photos, close-up shots, of my yard taped to the notices. Zoomed in, time-stamped. Someone was walking onto my property, snapping pictures. That's when the calm in my chest gave way to something older. Something I hadn't felt since active duty alertness. Rachel saw the tension creeping back into my shoulders. "You didn't retire to take orders again," she said one night, rubbing my back as I sat on the porch, staring at the latest warning. "We didn't move here to be policed by a clipboard." But I waited. I gave it time. Maybe she'd stop. Maybe Karen just needed control over something and I'd be her seasonal project. Then came the Friday morning in early June. I was in my workshop fine-tuning a cedar planter box, music low, tools tidy. The kind of morning that keeps your blood pressure low. Until the knock. No, not a knock. A pounding. Sharp. Authoritative. The kind that rattles the soul before it reaches your ears. I opened the door and found 2 officers standing stiffly on my porch. One of them was young, barely past his academy training. The other, a woman mid-30s, sharp eyes, kept her hand near her belt. "Mr. Hale," she asked. I nodded slowly, heart already sinking. "We've had a report of unauthorized construction on your premises," she said. "We need to ask a few questions." Behind them, at the end of the sidewalk, stood Karen, arms crossed, chin lifted. That same smug righteousness she wore like a badge. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. She thought she'd won. I felt the adrenaline coil low and familiar. A part of me wanted to laugh. Another part, the old part, had already scanned their badges, read the shift insignias, and noted the body cams. But I didn't show my hand, not yet. "Officers," I said calmly, stepping out and closing the door behind me. "You're responding to a complaint from the HOA." "Yes," the younger one said, glancing nervously at his partner. "We were told you're doing unpermitted work that may affect structural safety." I gestured toward the shed. "That's been here 2 years. Fully permitted. Want to see the paperwork?" The female officer raised a brow. "You have it on hand." "I always do," I said, and handed over a folder I kept in the cabinet by the workbench. Inside were permits, city inspections, and photos, all marked, signed, and sealed. She flipped through it slowly. Karen was inching closer now, trying to listen in. I turned to the officer. "Anything else?" She looked me over again, eyes narrowing like she was seeing something she couldn't quite place. "No, sir," she said, closing the folder. "Everything checks out." "Good," I replied, taking it back. Then casually, I reached into my back pocket and pulled out the ID I hadn't used in public in years. It was a small black leather wallet, creased at the edges. When I flipped it open, both officers leaned in, squinting at the silver shield and laminated credentials. Their eyes widened. The younger one took a full step back. The woman blinked, then straightened. "Commander Hale," she said quietly. I nodded. Karen's smile vanished. Whatever she'd expected, anger, compliance, humiliation, was gone. She had called the cops on me. And now she was watching those same cops say, "Yes, sir," to the man she tried to fine for painting a fence. Karen didn't say a word that day. She watched the officers nod respectfully, then return to their squad car without writing a single citation. Her face twitched, barely, but I saw it. The flicker of confusion, the cracks forming in her perfect composure. She had fired her shot, and it had landed in a wall she didn't know existed. But Karen was not the kind to retreat after one failed ambush. She was in her own way a tactician. The kind who didn't understand power beyond paperwork, but believed in bureaucracy as a weapon, and what she lacked in force, she made up for in persistence and paperwork. The very next morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA board. Notice of violation property at 119 Redwood Circle is found to be in repeated breach of HOA Regulation 14.B fence, color not matching approved pallet. Vehicle parked within 10 feet of sidewalk during non-designated hours. Decorative flag, unauthorized American flag without proper bracket mount. Cumulative fines $475. Failure to remit payment within 14 days may result in legal escalation. It was laughable if it hadn't come with an enclosed envelope and the unmistakable tone of a threat disguised as neighborly guidance. $475, Rachel read aloud, holding the letter with 2 fingers like it might stain her. "For a flag?" "No," I said, for not backing down. I wish I could say I shrugged it off, that I threw the letter away and spent the day back in my workshop. But something in my chest was shifting. Not anger exactly, more like the slow simmer of discipline reigniting. It's the feeling I used to get during long stakeouts waiting for a move that I already knew would come. 2 days later, another fine. This time it was the color of our garage door, eggshell white. Karen's letter claimed it was visibly outside the HOA-approved neutral spectrum. I stared at the swatch guide they'd attached. My garage door was 1 shade lighter than the sample approved. 1 shade. Rachel burst out laughing when she saw it. "She's color policing our house now." The laughter didn't last. The fines kept coming, week after week. Little things, absurd things. My rain barrel was too reflective. The garden hose visible from the sidewalk. Even the solar lights we'd placed along the path to the front door were now apparently potential tripping hazards in violation of Section 8.9. It was no longer about rules. It was about erosion wearing us down, one ridiculous regulation at a time. I reached out to other neighbors, wondering if it was just me. Turns out I wasn't the only one drowning in citations. Janet Lee across the street had been fined for planting petunias in the wrong season. Gerald Thompson and Linda Harris, a retired couple next door, were fighting a $200 charge for leaving their trash bins curbside for an extra half hour. She's been doing this since she got elected HOA president, Linda whispered like we were in enemy territory. But no one can stop her. She's friends with the previous board members. It's all rigged. She once fined me for sidewalk chalk, Janet added. Sidewalk chalk ray. My granddaughter was visiting. That night I sat on the back porch, a stack of letters in front of me, all stamped with the HOA's seal and Karen's perfect signature. I felt something growing inside, something that had stayed quiet for years. I had faced drug lords and domestic terror threats. I'd negotiated hostage situations and brokered peace between rival gangs. And now, in retirement, I was being harassed by a woman with a clipboard and a color wheel. Enough was enough. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. It was held in the community hall, a beige, soulless building that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and ego. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 other board members who looked more like her entourage than her peers. When I entered the room quieted, eyes turned. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. I signed in and took a seat near the front. She began the meeting with the usual platitudes. We're here to maintain the beauty and harmony of emphasis, Cedar Crest, she said, voice clipped. We take our bylaws seriously, and we expect every resident to do the same. I raised my hand. Karen's gaze flicked to me, then quickly away. Yes, Mr. Hale Ray, please, I said calmly. I just have a question. When was the last time the bylaws were reviewed for legal compliance? The room rustled. Karen cleared her throat. The bylaws are reviewed annually by the board, but not by legal counsel, I asked. Silence. One of the board members, a younger guy named Stephen Brooks, looked nervous. I think we usually just renew them by consensus. Interesting, I said, because I've gone through the handbook, and there are at least 6 policies that directly contradict municipal code. Karen's eyes narrowed. I continued. For example, the fine for a non-compliant vehicle, Section 7.4, conflicts with City Ordinance 33.1, which specifically states that as long as the vehicle is legally parked and not obstructing traffic, it's protected under local property rights. Stephen adjusted his collar. One of the other board members, an older woman, looked downright pale. Karen forced a smile. I'm sure you understand, Mr. Hale, that the HOA operates under its own jurisdiction. We are allowed to enforce standards that ensure the value of our homes, but not above the law, I replied. You operate under municipal oversight. You can't override city code, and you certainly can't issue fines for things like flag height when the federal statute says otherwise. Do you have a point, Mr. Hale? Karen snapped. I do, I said, standing slowly. I believe there's a culture of misuse of authority here, and I think residents deserve transparency, not intimidation. There was a murmur. Stephen avoided eye contact. The woman beside him actually nodded. Karen tried to wrap up the meeting quickly after that, but the seeds were planted. I had seen it before, how power begins to unravel when people realize it's not invincible. In the following days, I noticed a shift. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact were now waving. People stopped by to ask about their rights, about legal ordinances, about how they could push back, and Karen doubled down. She issued a neighborhood-wide memo reinforcing the authority of the HOA. She started a new campaign protecting the standards. But behind the polish and bold letters, I saw it. She was afraid. Not of me personally, but of losing control. Of being revealed as the paper tyrant she was. She wasn't dealing with a passive retiree anymore. She was dealing with a man who'd spent his life commanding not by fear, but by clarity, strategy, and quiet resolve. And I was just getting started. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the sun slanted just right through the pine trees that lined Redwood Circle, casting gentle shadows on the cracked sidewalks. I was in my backyard, standing knee-deep in mulch, reorganizing the raised beds for fall tomatoes. The scent of earth, the weight of peace. That's what retirement had always meant to me. Until I heard the unmistakable sound of police radios squawking and tires crunching up the gravel near my driveway. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Maybe they were checking on Gerald's place again. His house alarm was notoriously sensitive to squirrels. But when I wiped my gloves on a rag and stepped out front, there they were, two police cruisers, lights off, but unmistakably parked with purpose. And Karen, arms crossed, clipboard in one hand, sunglasses perched like a crown of authority. Her eyes flicked toward me like a trigger being pulled. "That's him," she said sharply, walking toward the officers. "That's the one." I raised an eyebrow. One of the officers, young, maybe late 20s, gave her a puzzled look. "You said there was a disturbance. A threat?" Karen nodded vigorously. "He's been aggressive, hostile. He's defying multiple HOA citations. He threatened board members." My jaw tightened. "No, I didn't," I said calmly, stepping closer. "And all of that is a civil issue, not a criminal one." The older officer, mid-40s, strong posture, studied me carefully. His eyes narrowed as I approached, not with suspicion, but with recognition. He leaned closer to his partner and muttered something under his breath. I stopped a few feet away, keeping my tone even. "Gentlemen, officers, is there a reason you're here on my property without a call to dispatch?" The younger cop looked uncertain, but the senior one cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report of a possible disturbance. Neighbor claimed there were raised voices, threats." Karen cut in. "He built an unauthorized structure, a workbench in his backyard. No permit, no submission to the HOA. He's openly defying community regulations." The older officer raised a hand to silence her. "Ma'am, this sounds like a civil dispute, not a criminal matter. We'll handle this." Then he turned fully to me. "Sir, your weight. Aren't you—" I gave a faint nod and reached for my wallet. With deliberate clarity, I pulled out my identification. A polished badge slid into view, nestled in the leather holder. Emphasis: Commander Raymond Hale, Metro Division. Retired badge 11348. The older officer's expression shifted instantly. His shoulders relaxed, but his eyes held newfound respect. The younger cop stepped back slightly. Karen's lips parted. I didn't know," she stammered. "You never said, you never asked," I replied evenly. There was a silence so heavy you could hear the wind stop. I gently tucked my badge back into my pocket. "I've served 32 years in law enforcement, Karen. I know the difference between enforcement and harassment. You crossed that line weeks ago." The older officer straightened. "We'll be noting this as a civil matter. No citations, no arrests. And I'd advise the HOA to be cautious in future claims." Karen looked like she'd swallowed glass. As the officers returned to their vehicles, she stood frozen on the edge of the lawn, still gripping her clipboard like it might shield her from reality. The very force she thought she controlled had slipped from her fingers like sand. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. That wasn't the point. But I did feel the tide shift beneath my feet. What Karen hadn't realized until that moment was this: I had spent decades navigating far more dangerous situations than a neighborhood rules enforcer with a superiority complex. I had brokered truces with gang leaders, negotiated hostage releases, led tactical operations where one wrong breath meant disaster. And yet here I was being accused of aggression for growing tomatoes and sanding a table. That afternoon, word spread faster than wildfire in dry grass. Stephen Brooks from down the block stopped by under the pretense of borrowing a power washer. So, Karen called the cops on emphasis, "you," he asked, not even trying to hide the smirk. "Did she not know you ran the police before you ran a garden?" "I guess not," I said, handing him the washer hose. The stories started rolling in from neighbors, whispers of other times Karen had overstepped. "She fined me for having a wind chime," Janet Lee told me. "She said my camper was an eyesore and had it towed without notice," Carlos Martinez said. It was as if a dam had cracked, and people were finally ready to speak. I kept my head down for a few days, knowing Karen would retreat, regroup, and return with another tactic. She had too much pride and too much paranoia to let a single public humiliation stop her crusade. Sure enough, 3 days later, another letter arrived. But this one wasn't a fine. It was a formal complaint issued to the HOA Legal Advisory Board, alleging I had intimidated law enforcement personnel and misrepresented myself to avoid HOA compliance. It was absurd, almost laughable. But it was also dangerous. Because if there's one thing I learned over a lifetime in service, it's that people like Karen weaponize perception. They don't need truth, they just need noise. Enough noise to confuse, distract, delay. So I did what I always do when things get complicated. I pulled out a notebook. I made a list. Complaint timeline. Every citation and their response. HOA charter violations. City zoning code inconsistencies. Bylaws updated without quorum. And then I called an old friend, Detective May Lynn, one of the sharpest legal minds I knew, and someone who owed me a favor from a joint task force in 2012. She wasn't just smart, she was surgical. After one look at the documents I sent her, she whistled. "Ray, she's skating on a legal pond that's cracking in 5 directions. So what do I do?" "You don't do anything yet," May said. "Let her keep digging. Every letter she sends without counsel is another nail in her own board's coffin. And when it's time, you drop the whole file on the city attorney's desk and make sure you're holding the pen when the press calls." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the pile of HOA letters, now neatly stacked and numbered. Karen had tried to frame me as the problem. But now, for the first time, I had a narrative, a timeline and a motive that wasn't about revenge, but about restraint. Because the real danger wasn't that Karen had called the cops. It's that she hadn't realized who she was calling them. Emphasis on. And by the time she did, the neighborhood would already know. After the cops left that day, things didn't go back to normal. Not entirely. Sure, the air was still crisp in the mornings, and my tomatoes still needed turning. But there was a crack in the facade of our neighborhood now, and it wasn't going to heal overnight. I went back to my usual routines, walking my Labrador Winston every morning along the quiet cul-de-sac, waving to the neighbors who pretended not to notice me 2 weeks ago, but now gave me a nod, or even a cautious smile. Karen, on the other hand, had retreated. No more early morning patrols with her clipboard, no more confrontational emails in the HOA newsletter. It was like someone had unplugged her battery, for now. But silence from someone like Karen was never a sign of surrender. It was a prelude. I knew this from years in the field. The louder someone barks, the less they bite. But when someone, emphasis, suddenly goes quiet, that's when you check your 6. Sure enough, the HOA bulletin that week included a new section labeled Security Advisory, written, of course, by Karen. It warned of individuals misrepresenting their authority and reminded residents that no one is exempt from community rules regardless of past professions. It didn't name me, but it didn't have to. I left it on the kitchen counter. Rachel found it first. "You're becoming quite the celebrity," she muttered, sipping her coffee. "She's trying to bait me," Rachel smirked. "And I'm not biting. Yet." Truth was, I didn't need to. The tide was shifting and Karen could feel it. At the next community meeting, which she chaired as usual, attendance doubled. Normally, maybe 10 people showed up. That night, more than 30. I took a seat in the back, arms crossed, face unreadable, just listening. Karen opened the meeting with her usual preamble about community values, then immediately pivoted into a diatribe about personal responsibility, respecting procedure, and the importance of integrity regardless of career history. She was baiting me again, this time in public. But I didn't rise. Instead, the woman next to me, Melissa Carter, raised her hand. "I'd like to talk about the front gate. It hasn't worked properly for 6 months." Karen blinked, and the security lights, another voice chimed in. "I've filed 3 requests. Nothing." It spread like wildfire. One by one, neighbors stood up asking questions Karen couldn't brush off. Not anymore. That night, for the first time, I watched her emphasis squirm. No badge. No title. Just pressure. After the meeting, she tried to corner me in the parking lot. "I don't appreciate being ambushed in my own meeting," she hissed. "You weren't ambushed," I said calmly. "You were held accountable. That's not the same thing. I know what you're doing," she snapped. I stepped a little closer, my voice steady. "I don't think you do. Because if you did, you'd stop before this turns into something much bigger than you." She stared at me, fury and panic dancing in her eyes. "You think you're intimidating?" "No," I said. "I think I'm patient, and I don't think that's something you're used to dealing with." I walked away, leaving her standing under the flickering parking lot light like a figure from a forgotten play, unsure whether she was the villain or the victim. The next few days were quiet again. But that didn't mean I was idle. I spent time digging, reading HOA bylaws, city codes, property deeds, digging with the precision of a detective and the patience of a soldier. And then I found it. A contract filed 5 years ago, where Karen had personally authorized a maintenance expenditure to a company owned by her brother-in-law. No competitive bids, no public disclosure. It was a minor infraction in the grand scheme of things. But it wasn't the only one. Not even close. There were others. Payments made just under the amount that required full board approval. Votes passed with only partial quorum. Fines collected with no formal due process. And then cherry on top a clause in the HOA charter that hadn't been updated since 1994. One that invalidated half of the rules Karen claimed were mandatory. I didn't go public right away. I gathered everything, labeled it, cataloged it. And then I made an appointment with the City Neighborhood Affairs Office. The woman at the desk was mid-30s, efficient bored, until I showed her the folder. When she saw the evidence, she sat up straight. "Is this current every page?" I said, "and I can testify to all of it." She flipped through the binder, her expression shifting from polite neutrality to something far more serious. "This isn't just an HOA violation. Some of this skirts fraud." I nodded. "Which is why I'm not asking for intervention. I'm offering cooperation. Are you planning to sue?" "Not yet." She paused. "You've built a hell of a case." "No," I said. "She built it. I just turned the lights on." Back home, I got a call from Detective May Lynn. "I talked to my contact in the city," she said. "They're rattled. Karen's got a lot of exposure now." "That's not what I'm after," I said. "I know. But if you're not careful, this won't just be a civil reshuffling, it'll be a scandal." "Let the city handle the legal fallout," I replied. "I've got something better in mind." "What's that, Justice?" I said. "And maybe some humility." I spent that evening out back again, raking up leaves under the gold-stained sky. The kind of sunset that makes the world feel honest, even if it isn't. Winston curled at my feet, snoring softly. Rachel brought out 2 mugs of cider and sat next to me on the bench I built last spring. "Are you going to take her down?" she asked gently. "I'm going to let her take herself down," I said. "But I'll make sure the landing doesn't break the neighborhood. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about Karen anymore. It was about what happens when a community forgets its own humanity. And what happens when someone reminds them." The change wasn't immediate. In fact, for a few days after that community meeting, life in the neighborhood carried on with its odd mixture of forced politeness and buried tensions. Most of the neighbors went back to pretending they didn't see me during their morning walks. Or if they did, it was that quick, polite nod that said more about obligation than warmth. But something had shifted, and not just in Karen. It started with the Bakers, a couple in their early 70s, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. They stopped me by the mailbox one afternoon while I was sorting through HOA junk mail. "Just wanted to say," Mr. Baker began, his voice low and steady, "we've seen what you're doing." I turned toward him slowly. "Doing?" He looked over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching, standing up to her, to them. Not many would. I gave him a modest nod. "Just doing what needs to be done." Mrs. Baker smiled a little sadly. "People are tired, you know. We paid our dues, followed the rules, and still got fined for planting sunflowers 3 inches outside the border." They walked away without another word, but the message lingered like morning dew, soft, real, and impossible to ignore. Over the next few days, those whispers turned into quiet conversations. Not full-blown rebellion, not yet. But neighbors began stopping me while I walked Winston or watered the lawn. I saw the footage Carlos Martinez said. "From the day Karen called the cops, can't believe you didn't say anything." "I didn't have to," I replied. "But she had no idea, right? Who you really were?" I shrugged. "She never asked." Carlos shook his head, smiling. "Damn poetic if you ask me. By week's end, I wasn't just being nodded at. I was being, emphasis, invited. Backyard barbecues, neighborhood walks. May Nguyen even asked if I'd speak at the local neighborhood watch meeting, not as a cop, but as someone who knows how to handle a bully without turning into one. I declined the public speaking gig. I wasn't ready to stand in front of a crowd. Not yet. But I started to realize something important. Karen's grip on the neighborhood wasn't loosening because of anything dramatic I had done. It was loosening because, emphasis, they had begun to remember their own power. They didn't need me to lead them. They just needed to remember that Karen didn't own them. And Karen could feel it. A week later, she held an emergency HOA board meeting. The email went out under the subject line, "Protecting Our Standards." I didn't attend not out of spite, but because I knew exactly what the meeting would be damage control dressed as leadership. But others did go. Melissa texted me halfway through. She's panicking, blaming outside influence for unrest. Someone brought up the fraudulent maintenance contracts. Her face turned red. Another message followed from Derek Wilson, a neighbor I barely knew. "You really lit the match. We're behind you. Let us know what you need." I didn't respond right away. That night, I pulled up the neighborhood's original development blueprints. I had gotten them from the city office last time I was there. As I traced the familiar streets and lots with my finger, something caught my eye. A narrow parcel of land just behind the HOA office building, oddly marked, oddly shaped. It was listed as easement adjacent private parcel. I checked the parcel number, cross-referenced it with the public property database. It wasn't owned by the HOA. It wasn't owned by the city either. It was emphasis for sale. Silently. No public listing. No signs. No open bids. Just a quiet private listing buried inside a broker's archive, probably hoping someone from the HOA would notice and quietly scoop it up before anyone else did. But someone had noticed. Me. I called the number on the record. A woman named Rhonda answered. Calm, businesslike. "Yes, that parcel's still available," she said. "Been on our books for a few months." "Why hasn't it sold?" "Zoning confusion," she admitted. "A lot of folks assume it belongs to the HOA. It doesn't. Clean title. Just needs the right buyer." I asked her to email the documents. 10 minutes later, I had the deed, the plot survey, and the current asking price, shockingly reasonable for what it represented. Because what it represented was leverage. The next morning, I called my investment broker. I need to cash in that dormant annuity. And I need to move fast. He sounded surprised. "You sure that account's been sitting untouched for, 15 years, I'm sure. Can I ask what it's for?" "A quiet piece of land," I said, with a whole lot of noise wrapped around it. Rachel watched me from across the kitchen as I made the transfer official. "Are we really doing this?" she asked. "We are." "Won't this make her come after you all harder?" I sipped my coffee. "She already has. This just makes sure I'm not standing in the open." That week, the sale went through. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Instead, I waited. Waited for Karen's next move. Waited to see how she'd react when the ground under her feet wasn't hers anymore. And when the time came, I'd be ready to show her. Because sometimes, justice doesn't knock. Sometimes, it just emphasis owns the doorframe. I waited exactly 5 days. 5 days of Karen acting like the queen bee, once more parading around HOA meetings, emailing warnings about trash bins left out, too long barking at teenagers for skateboarding near the park like they were hardened criminals. She even filed a formal complaint against the Martinez family for unauthorized seasonal decorations because their Halloween display had a fog machine. 5 days of pretending nothing had changed. But everything had. I had the deed framed, not because I wanted to show off, but because I needed to. Emphasis, feel the shift. To remind myself with every glance that I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was setting the stage. And Karen had no idea she was standing on it. But power, I've learned, doesn't unravel all at once. It frays slowly. A thread here, a stitch there. And the more you pull, the more you see how fragile it always was. I started pulling. First, I requested access to the HOA's publicly available documents, something every homeowner technically had the right to do, though Karen had a history of losing or misplacing records when those requests came in. But I knew how to file a proper notice, and this time, I CC'd the city compliance officer. I showed up at the HOA office 2 days later. Karen wasn't expecting me. "Oh, you..." she said, eyes narrowing behind her tortoise-shell reading glasses. "I'm here for the financials," I said. "You had 48 hours. She muttered something under her breath and pulled out a dusty binder from the back room. I could tell it hadn't been touched in months. I thanked her, didn't linger. But back home, I sat at my kitchen table, and opened it page by page, receipt by receipt. And what I found made me sick. Invoices for landscaping that never happened, payments to vendors that didn't exist, checks signed by Karen and cashed by her sister's LLC. Worse dates that lined up. Emphasis exactly with times residents were fined hundreds for infractions like chipped paint or faded mailbox numbers. I made copies. All of them. Next, I filed an anonymous complaint with the state HOA Oversight Board. Then one with the county attorney's office. And finally, one with the Better Business Bureau. Not because I expected them to do anything, but because paper trails matter. Still, I didn't go public. Not yet. Instead, I started talking. To neighbors, quietly, carefully. I invited the Bakers over for coffee, the Martinizes for a weekend BBQ. I helped Linda Harris replant her garden beds after Karen threatened to have them dug up for being too invasive. And during each visit, I shared what I'd found. I didn't yell. I didn't push. I just showed them the truth. And the whispers started again. Only this time they had shape, purpose, momentum. It wasn't long before Melissa Carter, the neighbor with the city council connection, reached out. "You've got more people than you think," she said. "We're ready." "Ready for what?" She smiled. "For a vote." Karen wasn't invincible. And under the HOA bylaws, ones she never thought anyone would read, if 60% of homeowners signed a petition, they could call for a full board review, a special election, a complete leadership shakeup. It wouldn't be easy. Karen still had allies. Fear made people obedient, but truth makes them brave. So I printed the petition. I didn't go door to door. I left it with people I trusted. Let them do the talking. Organically, quietly. Within a week, I had 74 signatures out of 110. Enough. I mailed it to the board's official P.O. box, sent copies to the oversight board, filed another to the city just to ensure a witness trail. Then I waited. Karen called an emergency HOA session 3 days later. Her tone in the email was fire and brimstone. "Attack on order," she wrote. Disruption fueled by outside forces. She still didn't know. Or maybe she did. Maybe that's why her hands were trembling when she opened the meeting that night in the community clubhouse. She stood at the podium like she was holding back a hurricane, surrounded by board members who looked less like a team and more like hostages. "I will not allow this community to be hijacked by paranoia and personal vendettas," she said, lips pressed so tight they nearly disappeared. I sat in the back row, said nothing. But one by one, neighbors stood. Melissa read the bylaws aloud. Mr. Baker asked where the landscaping money had gone. Mrs. Martinez held up a bill for $200. She was forced to pay for a supposed noise violation the same weekend Karen had used her driveway for a party. And then, Linda Harris. Sweet, quiet Linda, who had never raised her voice in all the years I'd lived near her. She stepped up and said one word. "Enough." Karen turned to me, then finally. "You did this." "No," I said, rising to my feet. Emphasis. "You did this. I just showed them the mirror." Her eyes burned. "You think this is over?" I didn't answer, because it wasn't. Not yet. The vote was scheduled for the following week. A secret ballot. Independent observers. No tampering. But I knew something Karen didn't. By that time, she'd already lost. Because the minute people stop being afraid, they start acting like owners again. The strange part of power, true power, is how little noise it needs to make. I learned that lesson over decades of service, but it became more real in my retirement than it ever was in uniform. After the morning, Karen called the cops on me, and they realized who I was. The tides had shifted, but I knew better than to mistake that moment for victory. Karen wouldn't back down just because she'd been embarrassed. In fact, people like her tend to double down. And they usually do it in the shadows, so I stayed quiet, but not idle. I began gathering information, not from police files, but from public records, real estate filings, HOA newsletters, archived emails that neighbors forwarded to me when I asked if they'd ever felt harassed. The stories poured in. One neighbor got fined for planting the wrong color mums, another for putting up Halloween decorations too early. A single mom down the street said she'd been threatened with a lien because her recycling bin was out a day too soon. All of it was small. Insignificant, maybe in isolation. But collectively, it painted a picture of obsession, control, and worse, of a neighborhood manipulated into silence. But I wasn't going to use a badge. That wouldn't solve anything. This wasn't about flexing power. It was about restoring balance. So I drafted a letter. A simple one. No seals, no signatures, no threats, just an invitation. Dear neighbors, you are invited to a community discussion on Saturday at 6:00 p.m. at the Park Pavilion. Topic our HOA, how we got here, and where we're going. I signed it simply. Emphasis, Raymond Hale resident, not commander. Not retired law enforcement, just a neighbor. I hand-delivered copies to every house I could, folded them, slid them under doormats. I even put a few up at the community bulletin board near the dog park and beside the coffee shop register where Karen's flyers used to hang. I wasn't sure who would show up. But at exactly 6:03 p.m. that Saturday, I stood in the center of the park pavilion and counted over 50 people seated on benches, picnic tables, even folding chairs they'd brought from home. Some were sipping coffee, some whispering, some just waiting. I cleared my throat and stepped forward. I appreciate you all being here. I began my voice steady but low, so people had to lean in a little to hear me. I didn't ask you here to yell or to shame or to fight. I asked you here because something's broken and it's not just fences or flower beds. There were nods, murmurs. I laid down a folder onto the table beside me. Printed emails, photos, screenshots, copies of HOA notices with excessive fines, threatening language, and citations that didn't match city code. This, I said, is what we've lived under, and it's not legal. But more than that, it's not right. Melissa Carter raised her hand. Why hasn't anyone challenged it before? Because most people don't know they can, I replied. They think the HOA is the law, but it's not. It's a contract, and contracts can be renegotiated. An older man, I'd never seen before, Vietnam vet hat, pulled low over his brow, stood up slowly. So what do? We start with accountability, I said. According to the bylaws, any group of residents can call for a special vote if they gather signatures from 25% of homeowners. That means 39 of us. What kind of vote? A young mother asked. A vote to recall the current board, I answered, and to nominate new candidates, people we trust. The silence that followed was heavy but not hesitant. It was the kind of silence people carry when they've waited too long to be heard and are suddenly unsure how to speak. I let it sit for a moment. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the petition form I'd drafted. I have 20 names already, I said. Not because I asked, but because people came to me after the incident last week. People who've had enough. One by one, people came forward. The first to sign was Linda Harris, the widow Karen once berated over lawn height. Then came the bakers who'd been fined for putting up a mailbox with a curved top. Then came Carlos Martinez. Then May Nguyen. Then Derek Wilson. When I looked down again, we had 48 names. I locked eyes with Melissa. She smiled. It's time, she said. We decided to submit the petition the following Monday. I delivered it myself to the HOA office. Karen wasn't there, only a temp assistant who looked confused and a little nervous. But I made sure it was time-stamped and recorded. Legally, the HOA had 7 days to respond and schedule the vote. They scheduled it for the maximum legal delay 28 days later. Fine. We had time. In that time, we didn't waste a minute. I helped organize a neighborhood newsletter. No branding, no slogans, just truth. We printed it ourselves. Well, Melissa did most of the design work, and we distributed it twice a week. Each edition told one story. One neighbor, one wrong, each with photos, emails, and the actual HOA bylaws right next to the violations Karen had invented. People started talking to each other again. Barriers broke down. Conversations sparked. Front porches were full of chairs again, not just surveillance signs. For the first time in years, people began to see their neighborhood as, emphasis, theirs. Karen, meanwhile, tried her best to cling to power. She sent out emergency bulletins, accusing me of inciting unrest. She called an emergency board meeting to discuss security threats, which only 5 people attended. She even tried to rally support by painting herself as the victim of a smear campaign. But the more she spoke, the more people saw through her. By the time the special vote approached, the tone of the entire neighborhood had shifted. Not just against Karen, but towards something better. Towards something we could build together. I didn't campaign, I didn't nominate myself, but I stood ready to protect the truth if it came under attack again. And this time I wasn't standing alone. The day of the vote arrived cloaked in a strange stillness like the air just before a thunderstorm. No lawnmowers hummed. No children chased one another down the sidewalk. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. It was as if the neighborhood itself sensed the weight of what was about to happen. The HOA had reserved the community center the same sterile room where Karen had once lectured about decorative wreath sizes and acceptable shades of mulch. Today, though, it buzzed with quiet anticipation. Folding chairs lined up in rows. A table at the front held a plastic ballot box hastily labeled with a Sharpie and masking tape. Volunteers selected from the non-board residents manned the check-in desk. I stood in the back corner, arms crossed, simply watching. Karen arrived exactly 9 minutes late, flanked by her inner circle Ron from finance, who once threatened to fine a woman for parking nose in instead of backed in. Angela, who never spoke unless she was quoting bylaws. And Cheryl, who had once led a petition to ban wind chimes. They swept into the room as if entering a courtroom, Karen in a blazer that screamed command and control. Her lips were pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared into her face. Let the record show she began loudly to no one in particular that this meeting is being conducted under protest, and I have already consulted legal counsel. No one responded. No one clapped. No one even looked up. That silence must have stung. The lead volunteer, Melissa Carter, stood up, clipboard in hand, and voice clear. Good afternoon, neighbors. As per HOA bylaws, Section 4B, this meeting has been called to allow a democratic vote regarding the recall of the current board and the nomination of new representatives. Karen's hand shot up. Point of order. You'll have your chance to speak, Melissa cut in calmly. We'll begin by reading the submitted petition and then provide 5 minutes per current board member for any remarks they wish to make. That petition, those 4 stapled pages of collected stories, signatures, and grievances, rang louder in the room than any gavel ever could. Karen's 5 minutes were tense and hollow. She talked of order of standards, of the danger of mob rule. She painted herself as the last line of defense against chaos, reminding us that without her, holiday decorations would spiral into anarchy and property values would plummet. But the words no longer landed. They bounced off the walls like rubber bullets, loud but harmless. One by one, the other board members spoke. Some admitted they had just followed Karen's lead. Others attempted to justify past decisions. A few, to their credit, looked down and simply said, "I'm sorry." When it came time to vote, there was no shouting, no chanting, no dramatic music. Just neighbors walking up, receiving a ballot, checking a box, and dropping it into the plastic container. Quiet revolution. I didn't vote first. I waited. Let others go before me. Watched as people who'd once been afraid of retaliation now moved with calm purpose. When I finally approached the table, Melissa handed me a folded slip and smiled faintly. "Thanks for lighting the match," she whispered. "I didn't light it," I replied. Emphasis. Karen did. I just made sure people saw the fire. The vote took nearly 2 hours to complete, every household eligible to cast 1 ballot. Once the last slip dropped into the box, the volunteers moved to the back to tally. We all waited. Karen paced near the windows, arms crossed, muttering under her breath. Her allies sat stiffly, their expressions shifting from defiance to uncertainty. It wasn't long before Derek Wilson, the quiet math teacher who'd volunteered to count, stood up and cleared his throat. 72 votes cast, he began. 55 in favor of full board recall. 17 opposed. Gasps, then silence. Then a single clap from Carlos Martinez, the mechanic who'd once been fined for installing solar lights. More claps joined, then cheers. Karen stood frozen. Melissa turned to her, voice steady. "You have 24 hours to surrender HOA credentials, passwords, and financial access to the Transitional Committee. You are no longer authorized to represent this community." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came. Instead, she spun on her heels and walked out. No one stopped her. No one followed. It was over. What came next wasn't jubilation. It wasn't smug victory. It was relief. Like letting out a breath we didn't know we'd been holding for years. People lingered. They talked, exchanged numbers. Someone suggested a potluck. Someone else offered to mow the vacant lot the HOA had ignored. Me. I sat quietly near the window watching the sun dip behind the trees. I hadn't done this for glory. I hadn't done it for revenge. I'd done it because no one else had and because I could. And that night as I walked home, the porch lights glowing from house to house felt warmer than they ever had before. The next morning began like any other, but it carried a strange quiet that wasn't emptiness. It was peace. For the first time in a long while, I sat on my porch with a coffee in hand and didn't feel like I was waiting for a shoe to drop. There were no notices taped to my mailbox, no citations tucked beneath my windshield wipers, no clipboard-wielding shadows lurking around the corner, just the slow hum of a neighborhood breathing again. By noon, the transitional committee, comprised of volunteers like Melissa Carlos Martinez and Derek Wilson, had already begun collecting the records and keys from the former HOA board. Some members cooperated quickly. Others slinked away, no longer interested in participating now that Karen's grip had broken. Karen herself refused to come in person. She sent a manila envelope instead, left anonymously, on the community center steps. Inside was a hastily scribbled resignation letter, a flash drive, and her master keycard. The letter, if you could call it that, was less apology and more accusation. She blamed ungrateful residents, an erosion of standards, and even coordinated manipulation by outsiders, clearly aimed at me. There was no mention of her missteps, no acknowledgement of the fear she'd instilled, no accountability. But that was fine. We didn't need her to confess. We just needed her gone. That evening, the transitional committee asked me to speak at the neighborhood gathering. It wasn't formal, just a few folding chairs set up under the old oak tree by the playground, some lemonade, and a modest crowd of 30 or so people. Melissa handed me the microphone with a smile. "We wouldn't be here without you," she said. But I shook my head before stepping up. I appreciate that I began glancing at familiar faces, some of whom had once crossed the street to avoid confrontation, now nodding with soft encouragement. But this was never about me. It was about us. All of us. I looked around, letting the silence settle. For years, we accepted rules we didn't understand. Penalties we didn't challenge. We were taught to believe compliance meant peace, but that wasn't peace. That was silence. And silence lets bullies grow loud. A few heads nodded. Someone clapped once awkwardly before others joined in. "I won't be running for any official position," I continued. "I'm not here to replace one form of control with another. But I am willing to help, to make sure we build something better, more transparent, more fair." Carlos Martinez stood up from the back. "Then be our advisor, our guide. You don't have to lead, but you can still watch our six." That drew a chuckle from a few veterans in the crowd. "I'll do that," I said, gladly. From there, things moved fast, but they moved the right way. A new election date was set. Candidate forums were announced. Bylaws were reviewed this time, with actual legal counsel, not just Karen's copy-paste interpretations from outdated manuals. The flash drive Karen had left behind held files we hadn't even known existed, some helpful, most damning. Misappropriated funds, inflated contractor invoices, unauthorized fines. We turned it all over to the county. And while formal charges would be up to authorities to pursue, we'd already gotten the most important verdict: freedom. One by one, neighbors began reintroducing themselves to each other. People who'd spent years feeling isolated behind hedges and fences now talked over those same fences, not through citations. We started a community garden, ironic, considering Karen had once fined someone for planting tomatoes in their front yard. That garden now sat right where Karen had parked her private golf cart. Poetic justice in the form of basil and cherry tomatoes. We removed the security cameras she'd secretly installed to monitor property standards. We scrapped the rule book down to its bones and rewrote it with clarity, fairness, and a sense of humanity. And me, I went back to my porch, to my wood shop, to the small joys that had once made retirement feel like a reward. I wasn't commander anymore. I wasn't the nuisance. I was just a neighbor. But now, one who was finally treated like one. Spring came early that year. The air felt lighter, less burdened by unseen tension. Lawns bloomed without worry of citation. Children laughed freely in the park, no longer silenced by Karen's imaginary quiet hours. Life, it seemed, had finally exhaled. For the first time since I moved in, I walked the neighborhood without bracing for confrontation. Neighbors waved. Some stopped to chat. Others offered baked goods, even hand-drawn thank you notes from their kids. One little girl handed me a crayon drawing of a house with a smiley face, and scrawled beneath it were the words, emphasis, thank you for making it safe. It brought a sting to my eyes I didn't try to hide. There was something poetic in it all. The same fences that once divided us now served as spots to hang string lights. Mailboxes became message boards. What was once a silent suburbia ruled by fear had bloomed into something close to kinship. Not perfect, but real. At the next community gathering under the same oak tree that had heard our first collective voice, we held a potluck. Tables overflowed with homemade dishes, enchiladas from Maria at the corner lot, sweet tea. From the Nguyen family barbecue, ribs from Derek Wilson. I brought fresh bread I'd baked that morning, rosemary and olive oil, still warm from the oven. It wasn't a feast for celebration. It was a meal for restoration. Carlos Martinez, now HOA president, stood up and tapped a glass with a spoon. I won't make a speech, he grinned, but I do want to acknowledge someone who gave us back our home. The crowd turned toward me, smiling. I didn't give anything, I said gently. I just reminded us what was already ours. A long pause, soft and full of meaning, stretched in the air. I didn't want to be anyone's hero. Just a man who fought for the right to sit in his backyard, listen to birdsong, and sand the edge of a chair without fear of retribution. Karen never returned, not physically, not metaphorically. We'd heard rumors she'd moved 2 towns over and attempted to join another HOA board, but word spreads, especially stories about fake power and real consequences. Last I heard, they weren't interested. Her reign was over. And what remained wasn't scorched earth, it was fertile ground. We planted hope in it. The new HOA bylaws included a clause about transparency, one that required every meeting to be recorded and shared. We added a resident feedback panel. We hosted community cleanups where people worked side by side and laughed again. I mentored younger folks in woodworking on weekends, built birdhouses with local kids, painted murals on the community shed that once served as Karen's surveillance post. Peace had returned not because someone handed it to us, but because we built it brick by brick. And the mortar wasn't law or power. It was trust. One evening, I sat on my porch as the sun dipped low and golden across the street. A teenager zipped by on a scooter. A couple strolled hand in hand. Somewhere a dog barked joyfully, not angrily. The mailbox beside me held no warnings. The gate didn't squeak under scrutiny. And the chair beneath me didn't creak with unease. I was home. Not in the sense of a house with walls and a roof, but in the truest sense, a place where I belonged. Where we all did. And as the stars blinked into view above a neighborhood finally free, I closed my eyes, exhaled, and smiled. I had no badge on my chest, no rank on my shoulder, but I had something stronger. Emphasis. Peace earned, shared, and protected by a quiet man with nothing to prove and everything to preserve.